This is going to be the Resurrection of the Dead Part 3, and this is Thomas Kissinger. Great to be with you. We're going to continue to go through this teaching, talking about the first resurrection, the second resurrection, and life and judgment, and how they play their part in these resurrections. We're going to be reading again from the writings of Dr. Stephen Jones. We're forever indebted to him. He does a tremendous job, brings out the details of this, the nuts and bolts, and really explains it to us and helps us to understand how these resurrections play a part, and a huge, major part in the plan of God. So let's get right on into this, and we're going to be reading from a section of his writings entitled The Order of Resurrection. Just enjoy this information. It's just tremendous. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:22 through 24, "For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive. But each man in his own order, tagma or squadron. Christ the firstfruits, after that those who are Christ's at his coming. Then comes the end when he delivers up the kingdom to God the Father, when he has abolished all rule and all authority and power. All will be made alive," Paul says, "just as all died in Adam. But not all will be raised at the same time." In other words, there is more than one resurrection, and everyone will be in his own squadron. Paul uses this military term to show that the resurrections do not occur individually, but to groups. There are some who say that resurrection happens when a person obtains faith in Christ or when he is baptized. Resurrection life is indeed imputed to each person by faith, as we see in Romans 6, but this is not the resurrection Paul was discussing here. In this resurrection chapter, Paul was painting a much bigger picture, showing first the problem that began with Adam, and then showing how that problem is to be overcome through Christ toward the end of history. In other words, in Christ, all will be made alive, but each in his own order. They will not all be raised at the same time. As far as I have been able to tell, the rabbis in Judaism did not contemplate more than a single resurrection at the end of the age. They disputed the scope of the resurrection, of course. Some thought only Israelites would be resurrected. Others thought it would include all of mankind. They agreed that all the dead would be judged at a great final judgment at the resurrection, but they did not have the insight that there would be more than one resurrection 1,000 years apart, as John says in Revelation 25. John tells us clearly that 1,000 years will separate the two resurrections. Some mistakenly dispute this on the grounds that Chilea, John's word for 1,000, is plural. But those objections are based on a basic misunderstanding of Greek grammar, which insists that the adjective must agree with the noun that it describes. Since the full phrase is 1,000 years, Chilea must agree with the word years, which is plural. Hence, Chilea is proper grammar. The proper English translation is 1,000, singular. Furthermore, rabbinical thought had already set forth the idea of a Sabbath millennium known as the Messianic Age, which was to be the culmination of the Great Week. Hence, the Jewish Encyclopedia under Messiah defines the term this way: the name or title of the ideal king of the Messianic age. John gives us no reason to believe that he differed with this view. If he had differed from the commonly held Jewish view, it is highly improbable that John would have mentioned the 1,000 years without some type of correction. In later years, Jewish thought increasingly adopted the Greek view, substituting immortality of the soul for resurrection. However, John gives no indication that he himself had adopted the Greek view. The first squadron. The Apostle Paul does not mention John's 1,000-year messianic age between the two resurrections. Yet Paul distinguishes between the resurrections, and in this way, His teaching agrees with that of John in the book of Revelation. The first squadron is Christ the first fruits. This translation seems to be accurate, given the fact that a few verses earlier in 1 Corinthians 15:20, Christ is said to be the first fruits of those who are asleep. The difficulty, however, is that Jesus Christ was an individual, not a squadron. Having already established the fact of Jesus' resurrection in verse 20, Paul has now moved on and has turned his attention in verse 23 to those who are asleep. For this reason, I believe this should be translated the anointed first fruits, referring to the first squadron of believers raised from the dead. These would be the ones raised in the first resurrection, Revelation 20, verses 5 and 6. The term, I believe, comes from the law in Leviticus 23, 11 through 13, which speaks of the sheaf of barley that was to be waved in the temple on the first Sunday after Passover. As we have already shown, this was known as the first of the first fruits, Exodus 34, 25 and 26. That is the first of the 3 first fruits offerings during the year. Of this barley sheaf, we read elsewhere in Leviticus 23:13. Its grain offering shall then be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, an offering by fire to the Lord for a soothing aroma, with its libation, 1/4 of a hin of wine. The Hebrew word balal can also be translated anointed, as we see in Psalm 92:10. Where we read, I have been anointed with fresh oil. So the grain offering of the first fruits is said to be an anointed first fruits offering. The second squadron. The 3 first fruits offerings each year, barley, wheat, and grapes, were offered at each of the 3 main feasts and are prophetic of those people, squadrons being offered to God. The barley company of overcomers is the first and smallest squadron that will be presented to God and given immortal life. This is a very limited number of people, for John says in Revelation 20, verse 5, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Verse 6 tells us that only believers will be given immortal life in the first resurrection. In the next resurrection, the dead, the great and the small, Revelation chapter 20, verse 12, will be summoned to the great white throne for judgment. Okay, here's your resurrection of judgment. This is also the rest of the dead from verse 5. Hence, any who did not make it in the first resurrection will be raised in the second 1,000 years later. This general resurrection, then, is the second squadron in Paul's exposition. Paul describes this squadron in 1 Corinthians 15:23, saying, after those who are Christ's at his coming. Most people assume that Christ's coming refers to the second coming of Christ, but the word translated coming is parousia, which means presence. Which presence or coming is this? If the first squadron has already been raised earlier at the second coming of Christ, then this must be another occasion. Indeed, it is where the second squadron, along with the rest of the dead, are summoned to the great white throne to stand in Christ's presence. In other words, it is not the occasion where Christ leaves his throne to come to them, but when they are summoned to the throne of Christ. The Greek phrase literally reads, in the presence of him, as the emphatic diaglott renders it. The people are summoned into his presence. So much information here. We'll stop there now, but just very exciting to hear the details unfold. It makes so much sense. It explains the plan of God, that God has 3 great harvests, the overcomers, the church in general, and the unbelievers, this barley harvest, the wheat harvest, and the grape harvest. And there is this great, precious first resurrection that we have the opportunity to press into. The first resurrection, the better resurrection, the out-resurrection that Paul called it, that we can be a part of this first and be raised to rule and reign with Jesus Christ on the earth and be the leaders in God's kingdom. We don't have to wait to the second resurrection, the resurrection of judgment. We can press in now and be an overcomer in God's kingdom.